Every Thursday morning, a man in Tehran checked his phone before he checked anything else. Not for messages from his wife, not for news, for a string of characters, meaningless to anyone who intercepted it, but to him, the difference between alive and compromised. The string arrived. He deleted it. He went about his day as a civil engineer, as a husband, as someone with no secrets worth dying for. One Thursday, the string did not arrive. He waited until afternoon. He told himself it was a technical delay, an encrypted channel hiccuping, a server somewhere behaving badly. He had been told this could happen. He had been told exactly what to do when it did: wait one full cycle, then two, then activate a contingency protocol that involved nothing more dramatic than changing his morning commute. By Friday, he had changed his commute. By Saturday, he understood that the contingency protocol was not designed for this situation. It was designed for a delay. This was not a delay. What he could not know, what nobody had told him, because nobody in Tel Aviv had figured it out yet, was that 3 other men in Iran had reached the same conclusion through the same silence. One of them had already made a decision that could not be undone. Another was being watched by people he had never noticed. A 5th man, in a city 200 kilometers away, had stopped answering his door 2 days earlier and would not answer it again. 5 people. 1 week. And in Tel Aviv, not yet a single explanation. If stories like this one pull you in, the ebook linked below goes deeper than any single video can. It covers the real operational cases behind the partnerships and the betrayals, the tradecraft that never makes the headlines. The link is in the description. Now, back to Tehran. The name Rami Avraham is not in any public record. It almost certainly is not his real name, and it is not the name his assets knew him by. But for the purposes of understanding what happened in early 2012 and why it happened the way it did, he is the figure at the center of it. He was a case officer. He had been running Iranian assets for the better part of a decade. Not a senior officer in the organizational sense, not yet, but experienced in the specific way that matters in his profession. He had developed sources in difficult environments, maintained them through years of operational silence, and brought intelligence back that justified the infrastructure his agency had built to support him. He worked out of a rotation of European cities. He did not work out of Tehran, which was impossible, or out of anywhere with an obvious Israeli connection, which was inadvisable. He worked primarily out of Istanbul. That detail is not incidental. It is the whole story. Istanbul had been the operational hub for Mossad's Iranian network for longer than Rami had been in the service. The logic was geographic and political. Turkey shared a long border with Iran. Iranian nationals could cross into Turkey for business, for medical treatment, for personal travel, in ways that Iranians could not easily cross into most Western countries. Istanbul was cosmopolitan enough that a meeting between an Israeli passport holder and an Iranian national could be explained as commerce, as academic exchange, as any number of things. More importantly, it was safe. Not safe in the sense that nothing bad could happen. This profession does not offer that. Safe in the sense that the institution responsible for Turkish domestic security, the MIT, had a formal understanding with the Mossad that went back to 1958. An understanding built in a private meeting between 2 prime ministers, formalized in a classified document, and maintained for more than 50 years by officers who had never read that document but understood implicitly what it meant. It meant, we do not watch your meetings here. It meant, this city is neutral ground. It meant, the infrastructure you build on our soil is yours, not ours, and we will not turn it into a weapon. Rami operated on that understanding the way any experienced officer operates on a doctrine that has been validated by 50 years of experience. He did not question it. He had no reason to question it. Neither did anyone else. That was the first risk, the one that doesn't look like a risk at the time. The assets Rami ran were not adventurers. They were not ideologues. They were Iranians who had made a calculation about where their interests lay and who had been patient enough, cautious enough, and in some cases lucky enough to survive that calculation for years. One of them, the civil engineer with the Thursday check-in, had been active for nearly 4 years. He had access to nothing dramatic, no nuclear documents, no missile specifications. But he had something that proved consistently valuable. He moved through government infrastructure project sites as a matter of routine, and what he saw, over time, built a picture of construction patterns, personnel movements, and logistical priorities that analysts in Tel Aviv found useful. He had met Rami twice in person, once in Istanbul, once in Tbilisi. He did not know Rami's real name. Rami did not know his. That compartmentalization was deliberate and correct. It meant that if the engineer was ever detained and interrogated, the damage he could cause was limited. He did not know the names of the other assets. He did not know the communication architecture above his own level. He knew one handler, one check in protocol, one emergency procedure. What the compartmentalization could not protect against was exposure that came from above, from a level where the connections between otherwise isolated nodes were visible, because someone was watching the meetings rather than the messages. That was the second risk. Still invisible, still accumulating. In 2009, Recep Tayyip Erdogan gave a speech at Davos and told the Israeli president to his face, in front of cameras, that he knew how to kill. The context was Gaza. The confrontation lasted 90 seconds. Erdogan walked off the stage. In Ankara and in Tel Aviv, people noted it and moved on. Politicians perform. Institutions persist. The MIT and the Mossad had survived colder political climates than this. In 2010, Israeli naval commandos boarded the Mavi Marmara in international waters, and 9 Turkish citizens were killed. Erdogan recalled the ambassador. Netanyahu refused to apologize. The relationship fractured publicly in ways that had no recent precedent. Still, the intelligence relationship held. Or appeared to hold. What changed, quietly and without announcement, was who was running Turkish intelligence. Hakan Fidan became director of the MIT in 2010. He was not a career intelligence officer. He was an Erdogan loyalist, a political operative, a man whose worldview had been shaped by the same foreign policy reorientation that had been reshaping Turkey's position in the region for a decade. Israeli intelligence officers had a private way of describing him to their American counterparts. They called him the Mois Station Chief in Ankara. Mois, the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security. It was not a literal accusation. It was a warning encoded in dark humor. The kind that circulates in agencies when something is wrong, but nothing has yet gone wrong enough to act on. The Americans noted it. They continued working with Fidan anyway. The Mossad noted it. They continued running meetings through Istanbul anyway. In January of 2012, Rami flew into Istanbul on a document that identified him as a Belgian national working in logistics consulting. He had used this legend before. The safe house was one he knew. The asset scheduled to meet him was a man he had run for 2 years, an Iranian national with connections to a government ministry, mid-level access, but reliable and careful. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Nothing went wrong. Nobody followed him to the airport. The asset crossed back into Iran within 48 hours. Rami sent his report and flew on to his next rotation. He did not know, could not have known, that the meeting had been photographed, that the faces in those photographs had been matched to travel documents, that a database somewhere in Ankara now contained, alongside the photograph, a name, a history, a pattern. He did not know, because the doctrine he operated under said this was not possible, because the doctrine had been accurate for 53 years, because the doctrine was built on a relationship that both sides had agreed, in 1958, to maintain. The question that nobody in Tel Aviv had yet thought to ask was a simple one. What happens to an agreement when one side decides it's no longer worth keeping? There is a specific kind of professional confidence that develops in intelligence work after years without a catastrophic failure. It is not arrogance. It is something subtler, a gradual narrowing of the imagination toward outcomes that experience has already validated. Rami had run assets through Istanbul for 8 years. In those 8 years, no meeting had been surveilled by Turkish counterintelligence. No asset had been burned through the Turkish corridor. No case officer had been identified through a meeting conducted on Turkish soil. The sample size was large enough, and the consistency was complete enough that the absence of risk had stopped feeling like luck and started feeling like law. This is not a character flaw. It is what institutional doctrine does to individual judgment. It replaces the question with the answer. By the spring of 2011, Rami was running 4 active assets through the Istanbul corridor. A 5th, the civil engineer he had met twice, was considered reliable but lower priority. Collectively, these 5 represented years of patient recruitment, careful maintenance, and a communication architecture that had never produced a detectable security incident. The intelligence they provided was unspectacular in the individual pieces and significant in the aggregate. Construction patterns near restricted sites, personnel rotations in certain ministries, logistical movements that cross-referenced with signals intelligence from other sources helped fill gaps in a picture that analysts spent considerable effort assembling. None of them were producing anything that could be described as a breakthrough. They were the kind of assets whose value is understood in retrospect, when their collective reporting, over years, has built a map that could not have been built any other way. Rami knew this. His superiors knew this. The operational logic for maintaining all 5 was sound. The operational logic for running them through the same corridor, using the same infrastructure, within a political environment that had been visibly deteriorating for 2 years, that logic had not been revisited. It should have been. In Tel Aviv, there had been conversations, not formal reviews of the Istanbul program, nothing that rose to the level of a documented reassessment, but the kind of corridor conversations that happen in agencies when something uncomfortable is in the air and nobody quite wants to put it on the record. One analyst, whose name has never appeared in public reporting, reportedly raised a concern in late 2010 that deserves attention. The MIT under Fidan was not the MIT under his predecessor. The political reorientation of Erdogan's government was real, visible, and accelerating. The assumption that institutional relationships outlast political change was an assumption worth stress testing. The concern was noted. It was not acted on. The reason it was not acted on was partly bureaucratic. Reassessing an entire operational corridor requires resources, generates disruption, and produces friction with the officers whose work depends on that corridor remaining stable. But it was also partly something harder to name. The Istanbul program had worked for 50 years. Changing it required someone at a sufficient level of authority to say, "The thing that has always worked is no longer working." That sentence is difficult to say inside any institution, and it is particularly difficult inside one whose operational culture prizes continuity and discretion above almost everything else. Rami was not the person who should have raised it. He was a case officer. His job was to run his assets. The architecture was someone else's responsibility. That division of responsibility, in retrospect, was itself a structural problem. Nobody owned the question. In October of 2011, Rami traveled to Istanbul for a scheduled meeting with the asset he considered his most valuable, a man with access to mid-level ministry connections whose reporting had been consistent for nearly 3 years. The meeting was routine by every measure. Safe house, established cover, clean approach. An hour of conversation. Clean departure. What happened after that meeting is where the certainty ends and the reconstruction begins. At some point, before, during, or after that October meeting, the MIT surveillance apparatus had produced something. Photographs, most likely. Possibly travel document records, cross-referenced with entry logs. Possibly both. The specific mechanism has never been confirmed in any public source. What can be inferred from the eventual outcome is that Fidan's MIT had been running surveillance on Israeli-Iranian contacts inside Turkey for long enough to build a usable picture, not a suspicion. A picture. Names, faces, travel patterns, meeting locations. The asset Rami met in October was in that picture. So, apparently, were others. The meeting Rami did not know about, the one that mattered more than any he had conducted, happened somewhere in Ankara in the months that followed. The details of how Turkish intelligence passed what it had assembled to Iranian intelligence have never been made public. Whether it was a direct meeting between MIT and MOS officers, a document transfer through intermediaries, or a more informal disclosure, the mechanism is unknown. What is known from reporting that emerged more than a year later is that the Turkish government made a deliberate decision. Not an accident, not a leak, a choice. The motive, as described by Western intelligence sources, was political. The Mavi Marmara deaths in 2010, Netanyahu's refusal to apologize, the ongoing deterioration of Turkish-Israeli relations under Fidan's direction. All of this had produced an environment in which harming Israeli intelligence interests was not merely acceptable, but, to some in Ankara, actively satisfying. The language used by one source was precise, an effort to slap the Israelis. That phrase contains the whole catastrophe. Not a strategic calculation about shifting alliances. Not a reasoned assessment of Iranian interests. A slap. An emotional retaliation, conducted using real people's lives as the instrument. The identities of up to 10 Iranians who had been meeting with Mossad case officers inside Turkey were passed to Iranian intelligence. Among them, almost certainly, were people Rami had met in Istanbul. Rami would not learn any of this for months. In the meantime, he continued working. In December of 2011, he received a communication from one of his assets that carried a tone he had not encountered before. Not alarmed, not urgent. Flat in a way that experienced handlers recognize as the suppression of something the asset cannot say directly. The asset mentioned, in passing, that he had been asked questions at his workplace. Routine security questions, he said. Nothing specific. He did not connect them to his work for Rami. He may not have believed they were connected. But he mentioned them, and Rami logged the mention. Rami flagged it in his reporting. It was assessed as low-grade ambient noise, the kind of security environment friction that Iranian government-adjacent workers experienced periodically. The assessment was not wrong, exactly, it was incomplete. He scheduled the next contact window and moved on. In January of 2012, in a conversation that was never intended to surface publicly, 2 senior officers in the relevant division had what could reasonably be described as an abort discussion. The term is loaded in intelligence contexts. It does not mean what it means in everyday language. It means, is there a case for pausing this operation, pulling back the exposure, letting a cycle pass while the picture clarifies? The case for pausing was not strong, technically nothing had failed. No asset had signaled compromise. The one flag Rami had logged was assessed as ambient. The program was producing intelligence. Pausing had costs, assets left without contact became anxious, sometimes made decisions in the silence that could not be undone. The case against pausing was operational inertia, which is a real force in these institutions and is not always irrational. Operations that are paused often do not restart cleanly. Infrastructure degrades. Assets recalibrate towards self-preservation. The decision made, or rather not made, since the conversation apparently ended without a formal recommendation, was to continue. Rami's next Istanbul meeting was not cancelled. The decision seemed reasonable at the time. Almost all of the decisions in this story seemed reasonable at the time. Here is what the abort discussion could not account for. Because nobody in the room knew it yet, the question they were asking, is the operation at risk, was already answered. The operation was not at risk. It had already been compromised. The identities had already been passed. The Iranian intelligence service had already received what it needed. The assets were already in the system, already being watched, already in whatever process Tehran uses to move from knowledge to action. The abort discussion was conducted in the past tense without knowing it. This is the reframe. Not that somebody made a bad decision in January of 2012. The bad decision, if it can even be called that, had been made over years, in increments, by people who never sat in the same room. The decision to keep using a corridor whose political foundations had been shifting. The decision not to stress-test a doctrine that had worked for 50 years. The decision not to formally act on the concern raised in 2010. No single officer made the decision that got those assets killed. The institution made it, collectively, through the accumulated weight of all the decisions that felt too small to make differently. That is a harder thing to assign blame for. And it is, consequently, a harder thing to fix. By February of 2012, Rami was back in Istanbul. The meeting happened. It went cleanly, by every observable measure. In Tehran, sometime in the weeks that followed, the civil engineer checked his phone on a Thursday morning and found exactly what he had been trained to look for. The string arrived. He deleted it. He went to work, the last normal Thursday of his life, and he had no way of knowing that was what it was. What was already in motion, in Tehran, in Ankara, in the silence between the things that had already been decided, was not something any check-in protocol could have detected. It was already done. It was only waiting to arrive. The meeting scheduled for the second week of March 2012 did not happen. Not because anything went wrong. Because the asset canceled. A brief message through the established channel, a family matter, a delayed travel document, a request to reschedule by 10 days. Routine language, the kind of message that arrives in any long-running operation periodically and means nothing except that human lives have inconvenient rhythms. Rami rescheduled. He noted the cancellation in his log with no flag attached. He had received cancellations before. This asset had canceled once in 3 years. The rescheduling request was polite, specific about the delay, and consistent with a man who understood the protocols. Nothing about it read as alarm. What Rami could not know was that the cancellation had nothing to do with a travel document. The asset had noticed something, not a surveillance team, not a direct threat, but the specific atmospheric wrongness that people in dangerous positions develop a sensitivity to over time. A question at the border crossing that was slightly different from the usual questions. A colleague who seemed more interested in his schedule than usual. He could not name it. He did not know if it was real. He rescheduled the meeting because he needed 10 days to think, and because asking for 10 days felt safer than canceling entirely. He used those 10 days to convince himself he was imagining things. The rescheduled meeting took place in the last week of March. Istanbul, a different safe house from the October meeting, same cover story, clean approach. Rami arrived first, as protocol required. He waited. The asset arrived 7 minutes late. He sat down. He looked like a man who had slept badly for 2 weeks, which he had. He gave his reporting, which was thinner than usual. Less detail, shorter time frames. A sense of someone who had been pulling back from the access points that made him useful. Rami noted this. He did not yet name it as a problem. They talked for 40 minutes. At the end, Rami asked the question he was trained to ask when something felt off without being identifiable. Was there anything in the current environment the asset wanted to flag? The asset said no. He said it without hesitation, which was itself a kind of answer, not the considered no of someone thinking back through recent weeks, but the reflexive no of someone who had already decided not to say yes. Rami let it go. The asset was experienced, careful, 3 years without a security incident. If he said no, that was his assessment to make. The incorrect assumption was here, embedded in a professional courtesy. Rami trusted the asset's judgment about his own safety, because the asset's judgment had always been reliable. He did not account for the possibility that the threat the asset was facing was not one the asset had the information to accurately assess. The asset crossed back into Iran 4 days later. He had a window of perhaps 3 weeks before it would not matter anymore. In early April, the first silence arrived. Not the civil engineer, he was still checking in. A different asset, one Rami considered secondary. A man with fewer connections and lower access, but consistent for 2 years. He missed his contact window on a Tuesday. Rami flagged it. His supervisor was informed. The assessment was, wait 1 cycle. The second silence arrived before the second cycle completed. A different asset, different city, different communication method. Also silent. At this point, the assessment changed. 2 simultaneous missed windows across isolated nodes was not a pattern that had a comfortable explanation. Rami was pulled into a call with his division and asked a sequence of questions he did not have answers to. Had there been any shared operational exposure between the 2 assets? Not to his knowledge, they did not know each other. Had never been in Turkey at the same time, used different channels. Was there any common thread in their recent reporting? No. Was there any reason to believe the missed windows were technical? Possibly. But 2 simultaneous failures of separate encrypted systems was not a hypothesis anyone wanted to rely on. The call ended without a formal conclusion. This was, in retrospect, the last moment at which something could have been done that might have mattered. A warning pushed to every active asset in the network. An emergency protocol activated. The civil engineer and the man Rami had met in March told to go dark immediately. That call did not produce that decision. The hesitation was partly legitimate uncertainty. 2 missed windows did not constitute confirmed compromise, and activating emergency protocols had costs, including the possible permanent loss of assets who were not in danger and would not understand why they had been abandoned. The decision made in the gap between that call and the next was silence. Wait for more information. More information arrived on a Thursday. The civil engineer missed his window. It was the first time in 4 years. Rami was notified within the hour. By the time he received the notification, the assessment inside his division had already shifted. Not officially, not in any document, but in the way people talk when they understand that something has crossed a threshold. 3 missed windows. 3 separate assets. 3 isolated nodes in a compartmentalized network that, by design, should not be failing simultaneously. There was a phone call between 2 senior officers that same afternoon. The word used, in the partial account that would emerge years later, was clean. They were trying to determine whether the network had been cleaned, industry language for a deliberate and systematic arrest operation. Not an accidental exposure, not a single penetration. A coordinated sweep. If it was a sweep, it meant someone had a map. The question of who had the map would not be answered for months. But the implication of the word clean was this. If someone had the map, the assets still operational were not safer than the ones who had gone silent. They were simply next. This was the moment to issue emergency warnings. Every case officer with active assets in the network understood this. The warnings were not issued. Not because anyone decided against issuing them. Because the confirmation required to justify the decision. The internal threshold for activating an emergency protocol that would dismantle an operational network representing years of investment had not technically been met. 3 missed windows was serious. 3 missed windows was not yet, in the language of the institution, confirmed compromise. The institution's language moved slower than events. On the Friday of that week, Iranian state television broadcast an announcement. A large network of Israeli spies had been dismantled. 15 suspects. The names were not given. The announcement was confident about scope, vague about details. In Tel Aviv, the first instinct was skepticism. Iranian counterintelligence had a history of announcing inflated successes, arresting 2 people, and describing a network of 15, extracting confessions under conditions that made their content unreliable. The number 15 was large enough to be suspicious on its own. Rami heard about the broadcast that same afternoon. He sat with it for an hour before he called upward. The call he made was not the one he should have made. He did not say, activate emergency protocols, warn every remaining asset, assume the worst. He said, what do we know? He asked the question because he believed, on some level he would later be unable to fully explain, that the answer might still be recoverable. That the broadcast might be partially fabricated, that the 3 missing assets might be 3 and not more, that the map, if it existed, might be incomplete. That belief, the false release, the moment of professional hope that functions as its own form of blindness, lasted approximately 48 hours. On Sunday, the asset Rami had met in late March, the one who had canceled and then convinced himself he was imagining things, stopped responding. The asset Rami had let walk back into Iran with an incomplete assessment of his own danger was now inside the silence with the others. 5 gone. The network's core, operational for years, built through patience and infrastructure, and a bilateral understanding with a country that had decided, somewhere above both Rami and his assets, that the understanding was no longer binding. Rami did not know that last part yet. He thought he was looking for a mole. He was looking in exactly the wrong direction. The mole hunt began before the last asset went silent. This is how institutions respond to sudden, unexplained loss. They look inward first, because the alternative requires acknowledging something worse. A penetration inside the agency is a containable problem. It has a solution: find the person, remove them, repair the damage, rebuild. It is painful and corrosive, and it destroys careers, sometimes innocent ones. But it is a solvable problem. What Rami's division was about to discover was not a solvable problem in that sense. The internal review that opened in April of 2012 was methodical. Access logs were pulled. Every officer who had handled reporting from the compromised assets was reviewed. Travel records were cross-referenced. Financial accounts were checked. The process consumed weeks and considerable internal resource. It produced nothing. No anomalous access, no unexplained contact. No financial irregularity that could not be explained. The absence of a mole finding did not resolve the question. It deepened it. A network does not lose 5 compartmentalized assets simultaneously because of bad luck. It does not lose them through independent coincidences in separate cities, using separate communication channels within the same narrow window. The simultaneity was the data point. Whatever had caused this had visibility across the whole network, not through any single asset, not through any single officer, but through the one thing all 5 assets had in common: Turkey. The Turkish hypothesis emerged formally within the division sometime in the late spring of 2012. By that point, it was less a hypothesis than a conclusion reached reluctantly, the way you accept a diagnosis after ruling out everything else. The reconstruction was straightforward once the framing shifted. The MIT had the technical capability to conduct surveillance of Israeli-Iranian meetings inside Turkey. It had always had that capability. The question had never been capability. The question had been intent, and intent had been answered by 53 years of consistent institutional behavior that had stopped being consistent sometime around 2010. Every asset who had been lost had used the Turkish corridor. Every lost meeting had occurred on Turkish soil. The MIT under Fidan had been running aggressive counterintelligence surveillance of Israeli-Iranian contacts. For how long and how systematically was still unknown. What it had assembled, and when it had passed that to Tehran, and through what channel, these were questions that would take a year to partially answer, and would never be fully answered in any public record. What the division understood by midsummer was this: the loss had not come from inside. It had come from the institution they had trusted to protect their infrastructure, which had turned that infrastructure into a weapon and handed it to an adversary. The anger that followed was real. It was also, in the operational sense, useless. The Turkish corridor closed. Not with a formal announcement, nothing about this appeared in any public communication from either government. It closed the way things close in intelligence, gradually, through the cessation of activity, through case officers being redirected, through the infrastructure of meetings and safe houses and coordinated logistics simply not being renewed. 53 years of operational investment became unusable in a matter of months. The practical consequence was severe. Iran does not permit easy access to Western or Israeli intelligence assets. The Turkish route, accessible, logistically established, administered by a service that had agreed not to interfere, had been the primary mechanism through which human intelligence on Iran was developed and maintained. Without it, the question of how to recruit new assets, how to meet existing ones, how to sustain any network inside the Islamic Republic became a first principles problem. Alternative corridors existed. Other countries with Iranian diaspora populations, other geographic access points, other bilateral relationships, none of them had what Turkey had offered. Accessibility and trust, built over decades, do not reconstitute quickly. In the years that followed, Israeli intelligence's human asset coverage inside Iran operated under constraints it had not faced since the 1970s. There was a second consequence, less operationally visible, but in some ways more significant. In Washington, the decision had been made not to protest to Ankara. American-Turkish relations in 2012 were, from Washington's perspective, too strategically valuable to compromise over an intelligence dispute that, however damaging to Israel, was technically a bilateral matter between Ankara and Jerusalem. The decision was rational by the logic of statecraft. It was also, to Israeli intelligence, a clarifying signal. A NATO ally had handed a list of Israeli assets to a hostile power. The United States knew. The United States said nothing. The conclusion available from that sequence of events was not comfortable. In a conflict between Israeli intelligence interests and American-Turkish strategic relations, Israeli intelligence interests would not be the deciding factor. This did not rupture the American-Israeli intelligence relationship. It adjusted it. Trust, once stress-tested in this way, does not return to its prior state. The intelligence relationship continued, as it continues today, but with an awareness on the Israeli side that shared information and shared infrastructure carry risks that 50 years of stable cooperation had made it easy to forget. Former Mossad director Danny Yadam put it plainly when the story surfaced publicly in October of 2013. No Western intelligence agency, he said, could cooperate with Turkey going forward without accounting for the risk that Turkey might do the same thing again. He was right. And the implication extended further than Turkey. Any allied intelligence relationship rests on unwritten rules, and unwritten rules have no enforcement mechanism except the mutual belief that breaking them costs more than honoring them. When that belief changes, the rules are already gone. The ink was never there to begin with. Rami, or whoever the case officer at the center of this was, carried the weight that case officers always carry in these situations, which is the weight of the last decision. The March meeting. The asset who said no and was believed. The 48 hours of false release that did not produce an emergency warning. None of those decisions were wrong by the standard of the information available at the time. That is the specific texture of this kind of failure. The decisions feel defensible in retrospect, which means they cannot be fully grieved. There is no clean moment of error to assign blame to and move past. There is only the accumulation of reasonable choices that led to an unreasonable outcome. The assets themselves, 5 Iranian nationals whose names are not in any public record, whose fates were not announced, whose families received whatever explanation a security state provides when it wishes to explain nothing, remain in the institutional silence that surrounds all of this. They had made a calculation about where their interests lay. They had been careful, patient, and for years, right? They had trusted a system that trusted a corridor that trusted an agreement that had already been quietly abandoned. The operational record of how that trust was built, maintained, and ultimately weaponized does not appear in any public file. Some of what is known, the methods behind long-term asset handling, the infrastructure of networks run through partner nations, the doctrine that developed from cases like this one, is in what we put together an ebook mentioned in the description below. It covers the operational cases behind the partnerships and the betrayals, not the headlines, but the methods that produce them. The ebook link is in the description. Subscribe for more such videos.